Hi, my name is AChildress, and today I will be examining Native American language culture in the United States. So, words are powerful. They have the power to influence, to degrade, to interpret, to contradict, and the languages made up of such words are precious. So, once upon a time, I was reading a National Geographic article called Vanishing Voices by Russ Reimer, and what really stood out to me is that if you lose a language, not only do you lose, the alphabets in it and the accents, but you lose the culture in it as well. So this idea, along with this movie called Code Talkers that I was watching about Native American languages, sparked the idea for my project. So in my project, I will be explaining the impact of Native American language on non-Native American society versus the impact of non-Native American language on Native American society. So just to clarify, when I say non-Native Americans, I mean the American populace that's not of Native American descent, so pretty much everyone else. And non-Native American language just refers to the slurs and descriptions of Native American languages. So after my research, I came to the conclusion that while Native American languages have enriched modern American life, indigenous peoples have simultaneously been degraded by misrepresented language in the United States. So this project has two main parts. One is the positive impact of Native American language on American society, and the second is the negative impact of non-Native American language on indigenous society. So in the first perspective, I'll be exploring modern ecology and conservation and the Code Talkers. These are the two major positive contributions. Okay, so first and foremost, it's important to understand that Native American culture values nature. And we can see this in many things, through their tribe names, like the Buffalo tribe, and through character names, such as Old Man Coyote and other American myth names. Okay, so this value of nature and Native American language culture has shaped modern ecology and conservation today. So this man named George Bird Grinnell, who was a famous American anthropologist, historian, naturalist, writer, and early 19th century conservationist, he basically paved the way for modern ecology. And where did he get his ideas about conservation and ecology from? Native American language. So in 1899, he went on an expedition in Alaska called the Harriman Alaska Expedition, where he spent 58 years studying Native American languages. And he attributed the following accomplishments to their language. In 1935, he was awarded the Theodore Roosevelt Gold Medal and was called the father and patron saint of American conservation. Next. However, nature is not the only thing Native American languages have saved. Like I mentioned earlier, there are these people called the Code Talkers, and they were Native Americans who served in the U.S. military during World War I and World War II, and they used their dialects as a code that was not able to be broken by the Germans and the Japanese. So in World War I, there were 19 Choctaw speakers, and their code was really hard to decipher because it had many layers to it. So for instance, as I said earlier, nature is a huge part of Native American language, and they didn't have words for things like planes or dive bombers, so instead they had things like chicken hawks or other types of birds. So it had multiple layers. So if you wanted to say dive bomber, you'd say guinea in Choctaw, which means chicken hawk. So, and since the Native American languages weren't really written down at the time, the Germans didn't really know them. But even if they miraculously did understand that guinea meant chicken hawk, they wouldn't know that that meant dive bomber. So it was these many layers that made it so successful, and it was used again in World War II. Because it was so successful. In fact, Major Howard Connor, who was the signal officer of the Navajos, said that were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima, which was a huge turning point in World War II. However, despite all these amazing contributions to American society by the Native Americans and their language, non-Native American language has degraded indigenous society in the U.S. And it's done this in three major ways. The first is through boarding schools. So in the early 19th century, there were these boarding schools funded by the American government, and they were English-speaking, and Native Americans were forced to go here on reservations where they would basically get rid of their dialects and force them to learn English. In 1964, Richard Henry Pratt, who was the founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was one of these boarding schools, said the following: "In Indian civilization, I am a Baptist, because I believe in immersing the Indian in our civilization, and when we get them under, holding them there until they are thoroughly so." So he's not really subtle about his assimilation and indoctrination. Next. Ironically, the same government that used Native American languages to its advantage during World War I and World War II now sought to eradicate them through these boarding schools. John Brown Jr., who was one of these code talkers, said that during his time at the boarding schools, they told us not to speak a nominal language. If you're going to school, you're supposed to only speak English. And it was true. They did practice that, and we got punished if you were caught speaking nominal. So it's clear from these examples that despite its major contributions, Native American languages and the culture within them are undervalued by non-native language, like English, which is what it was replaced with. Next. Oh, this is another example. Next. The next is misrepresented language. So although such boarding schools are fortunately no longer prevalent in the United States, misrepresentative language surrounding Native American culture is. In a 2016 University of Washington master's thesis, Sierra Ann Young interviewed 6 Native American interpreters at history museums across the U.S., measuring the severity and types of racism that they experienced from non-native tourists daily. According to her results, 100% either experienced or saw their fellow Native interpreters experience what can be defined as a racial microaggression. And the most common form of these microaggressions were racial epithets, including squaw, redskin, chief, and brave. Next. And 4 out of the 6 interpreters blatantly stereotypes on the representation of Native Americans on television. And this is a logical conclusion because if Native Americans from across the United States are all undergoing the same sort of stereotyping, then there must be some factor connecting all this together. And this factor is American media. So one such example of representation on television occurs many Sunday, Monday, and Thursday nights. 86 years ago, in 1932, the NFL team, the Washington Redskins, was founded. Also 86 years ago, there was little understanding of indigenous culture by non-Native Americans, and institutions like the boarding school I mentioned earlier were accepted and promoted by the American government. So what's so bad about the name Redskin, you ask? Well, according to an article by The Atlantic, every major English dictionary recognizes the term Redskin as derogatory toward Native Americans. And according to an article from the Minnesota newspaper The Daily Republican, written in 1863, the same time this term was coined, this term is a reference to the bloody scalps of hunted Native Americans which were sold for bounties. Next. So according to a 2004 study on the effects of this Washington mascot on Native American health, conducted by Michael A. Friedman, the racist implications of the Redskin mascot have been directly linked to high levels of the following. As well as suicidal thoughts and actions among children as young as age 9. Next. There was another study done on 12-year-old Native Americans, and 1 in 10 reported current thoughts about killing themselves because of the racism that they experience every day. Okay, next. Oh, this is another one. Next. So clearly there is a dissociation between the rich culture of indigenous language that is positively impacted American society and the way it's recognized by American media. This imbalance is unfair to the Native Americans and their culture, inaccurately presenting them to the American population and undermining their positive contributions to the U.S. Next. However, despite the polar portrayals of this presentation, it is important to recognize that issues like these are never totally black and white. Although only the positive contributions of Native Americans are highlighted in this presentation, that is not to say that the Native Americans are a perfect, flawless, peaceful people free of all crime and violence. Rather, this presentation serves to counteract the one-sided media representation of indigenous peoples by bringing to light their overlooked positive contributions. Next. Conversely, not all Native American representation in mainstream American media is negative either. In 2013, a DNA photographer named Matika Wilbur started this project called Project 562, which is dedicated to photographing all 562 federally recognized Native American tribes in the United States to sort of change the stereotype. And in 2014, she shared her work in a TEDx talk, which is a popular American media platform. However, despite significant activism on projects like this, racism towards indigenous people still prevails in the media, often overpowering such projects, an issue this presentation intended to raise awareness of and to inspire urgent change. So how do we bring about this change? Well, one pretty obvious solution I thought of was change the Redskins team name, because clearly there are lots of health effects. And there have been many movements trying to get the name changed. There was actually a United States Supreme Court case in June 2017 regarding the name. However, the Supreme Court vindicated the team's position that the First Amendment blocks the government from denying or canceling trademark registration based on the government's opinion. So the fact that an undeniably racist slur resulting in countless dangerous effects on an American minority group is still protected under First Amendment rights is very problematic. And this is a deafening call for constitutional reform. But of course, First Amendment rights are important and were some of the founding principles of our nation, but citizen safety and protection from such discrimination is equally as important. The fact that racial representation issues that were prevalent 243 years ago during the birth of the U.S. are still prevalent today means that clearly Indigenous representation is not seen as a priority or major issue in the United States, which is also a problem. But hopefully, through increased accurate education about Native American culture in school curriculums across the nation, this can change. This would mean updated history textbooks and other potential costs, but it would also lead to increased Indigenous employment, which is good. Additionally, the gradual erasure of such racial slurs would lower the aforementioned health risks, which would save the government money on health care. Also, suicide rates among Native Americans would decline, which would also cut social welfare costs, and suicide is bad. Increased cognizance of this misrepresentation through Indigenous awareness projects is also an essential action, because although there are things like Project 562, there's clearly high demand for it. Despite the long journey ahead, hope is not out of reach. Awareness of this disconnect between rich Indigenous language culture and its portrayal in popular American media is the first step toward eventually achieving accurate representation of the original Americans. Thank you.
So let me ask, what information did you need that you weren't able to find or locate during this project? And how'd you go about trying to find them?
Well, when I was trying to find how Native American language culture influenced modern ecology, that was actually surprisingly hard to find because a lot of these people like George Bird Grinnell, they don't attribute their knowledge of conservation to the Native Americans. Actually, George Bird Grinnell was one of the only people who did this, even though it's been proven that it did come from the Native Americans. So that was actually really sad to me that they didn't, accredit the people who started this with this information. But I did find a really good source. I think it was called Native American Myths and Legends, which did mention his name, and I was able to find it through that.
And secondly, if you had more time, what additional research would you conduct related to this issue?
I would probably look into more of why Indigenous representation is not really a priority in the United States, because it's clear that it's not, but it would be interesting to see why. Like, is it because they, only make up 2% of the population, or is it because, they're just not seen as important? Like, it would be interesting